Y'all, it's September, the month in which many need to return to school or university, or at the very least maybe work if you've been lucky enough to have a long summer holiday. So I figured, why not dive into some magical dark academia territory with you? I'm going to do my best to cover an entire trilogy, so maybe get some coffee before you jump aboard. Welcome to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, and confession time. I have a pretty big love for dark academia. Maybe this isn't really a surprise, considering I once wanted to study the classics, and now I'm a medievalist. But still, for those of you who are new to the idea, dark academia is something that, like so many things, kind of started online and then grew into an entire subculture, which you'll find on Instagram, Tumblr, Twitter, and maybe even in real life. At its most basic, I'd say, dark academia refers to this idealized version of higher education, which emphasizes the arts and literature, except that the dark element of it implies you can and probably will get lost in it. The look of the whole movement is very much inspired by kind of 1930s, 1940s fashion, and it's quite preppy, which isn't really my look. I kind of prefer to study in yoga pants, but it is pretty to look at. Of course, with the idealization of higher education, you also have to face some, how would I best put it, a kind of idealization of upper class aesthetics. So there are a lot of blazers and, what they're starting to call quiet wealth, where things look expensive, not because there's a label all over it, but because it just looks well made. And it can be a little bit exclusive. The idea of dark academia, it can look very white, is what I'm trying to say, I guess. But I've seen plenty of inclusive dark academia content online as well. And actually, as someone who works at university, I very much like the fact that maybe dark academia would make entering higher education something that's also a little more desirable, a little more open, something connected to excitement rather than just endless grift and work. So yeah, I'm a little conflicted about it, but that's because I do also like it very much. The whole dark academia, I think, kind of found its roots in the Harry Potter generation, of which I am a part, because we all desperately wanted to go to a big castle in the Scottish Highlands to learn about magic and make everlasting friendships with others through trials and tribulations. Unfortunately, recent developments have made that less of a safe, comforting space for many of us, so that's a bummer. What really kicked the whole dark academia into gear, though, was when readers sort of rediscovered Donna Tartt's The Secret History, which was first published in 1992. The novel is something of a whodunit rather than a whodunit, a thriller book set at an elite New England college where a murder has taken place among a group of classics students. In the last decade, this subculture has really exploded, and loads of novels, especially I think those aimed at young adult and new adult audiences, those who might still be going through education in that sense, and especially within the fantasy genre, they now feature a lot of dark academia content in one way or another. Why this entire preamble, you may wonder? Because I want to talk about a trilogy, which I recently finished, The Scholomance by Naomi Novik, which is made up of A Deadly Education, The Last Graduate, and The Golden Enclaves. All in all, this trilogy encompasses over 1,000 pages, and y'all don't need me to going through all of that in detail. But I'd love for you to also still want to read it after I'm done, so I'm going to give you mini blurbs for each book. There will of course still be some spoilers along the way, so bear that in mind. A Deadly Education tells the story of Elle, which is an abbreviation for, get this, Galadriel. I was on board from the moment that name was revealed, because no one blessed/cursed with that name is going to have a normal life. Anyway, Elle has been sucked into the Scholomance and has managed to survive so far, because the Scholomance isn't a normal school. In the outside world, there are Maleficaria or Mals, which are these weird, almost demon-like creatures that stalk magical children in the hopes to gobble them up for their magical energy called mana. The Scholomance was created And it's this kind of, I guess, Hogwarts-like, but not really, school meets castle / something else, which floats in the void and is protected by really strong warding spells. It has no teachers, but loads of magic. Unfortunately, it's also quite a deadly place. The Scholomance basically sucks in a child, educates it as far as that's possible, and then spits it back out upon graduation day. Except that the Scholomance also attracts loads of mals, and most students end up fighting for their life on a daily basis, which is quite a deadly education, so the title is completely correct. It's a grim place, and still a part of me is like, I'll take fighting demons if I can learn Old English magic. Yeah, that's fair. Anyways, Elle is actually quite suited to this place because she's just brimming with dark and dangerous powers. She's trying to stay under the radar though and not give in to this dark side, but that only kind of half works because the Scholomance keeps sending her textbooks and manuscripts about how to summon victims and unleash hell and create a massive volcano. Despite her powers, she doesn't really know if she'll survive graduation or if she'll even make it till then, because she's just trying to build up as much power or mana as possible, but it's not really working. And graduation is basically a full-on, non-stop battle with hordes of mals, and you just have to literally kill your way out of the school. In a deadly education, Elle begins to form alliances with some of the other students, which is at once really necessary, but it's also quite rare that that actually happens. Some students have powerful enclaves behind them who send them mana, and that kind of allows them to defend themselves. They have something to give to others as well, and Elle has literally nothing to give except her own slightly evil self. One of those enclave kids is Gideon, who has a hero complex, but is also something of a golden retriever of a boy. That boy just wants to kill as many mals as possible, save other kids while he does it, and he doesn't really expect anything in return. He's adorable. Elle has now found her allies, and she's willing to go as far as possible to keep them safe. The question is, will they be able to keep each other safe? And will they be able to save this year's graduating class? In The Last Graduate, the second book, Elle, Gideon, and their troop of faithful friends were able to fix some of the Scolomance's issues, which means that the mals are becoming a slightly lesser problem within the school. Except now they're all kind of gathering in the graduation hall, promising an absolute massacre for the next few graduation classes. So they once again have to come up with a plan to save as many students as possible, which is something the Scholomance itself actually seems to appreciate. The question now is whether fragile alliances can grow stronger. Can students from different enclaves, different countries actually work together? And can Elle control the powers that course through her once she starts kind of giving into the dark a little more, even if she's doing it to save others? And could Gideon get any more golden retriever-like? No spoilers, well, some spoilers. But I absolutely loved the way this book continued on the first one. It was a real solid expansion of the characterization and of the school, and thereby some of the world building as well, even though we're technically still limited to just being in the school. And then there is the Golden Enclaves, the final book. Well, halfway through The Last Graduate, Elle is kind of gifted by the Scholomance with a manuscript about the Golden Enclaves. This manuscript could teach her how to set up enclaves without relying on Malia, which is like the opposite of mana, so it's like bad magic. And these enclaves could be built by smaller groups of magic users who don't have as much influence or wealth as the bigger ones. Elle wants the world to become more egalitarian, more free, more equal. She wants everyone to be protected. These were her hopes at the end of The Last Graduate, but their final escape from the Scholomance was, of course, tinged with tragedy. And so Elle is now torn between two things. Should she go set up these enclaves, or try to locate the Scholomance in the void and save its last graduate? This final book really expands the world, and it also has quite a different pace because we're no longer in the Scholomance itself, but in the big wide world. And rather than having an entire school year, the plot kind of takes place over just a few weeks. So that was your little introduction to the Scholomance Trilogy. Now, of course, there were quite a few things that I adored about this trilogy, so that's what I'm going to share with you now. The first thing really is the writing. Naomi Novik is a brilliant writer, and I've enjoyed reading her books. It was really her book Spinning Silver which made me want to pick up A Deadly Education, because her writing in those books, like, there is so much precision to her language, and she really showed a deep understanding of her main characters in that book. And I really wanted to see that again, but just in a slightly different context. And these same skills are at play throughout the entire trilogy, but I was really sucked into A Deadly Education from the start. Throughout the story, and throughout the entire series really, Elle has a really strong voice, as the entire trilogy is really told from her perspective through a first-person narration. Now, usually I'm not a big fan of first-person narration, I guess because it kind of makes me feel like I'm stuck inside someone else's head, and I don't even always like being stuck in my own head. And especially if a character does something dumb, I'm like, don't make me complicit in that with the first-person narration. But that wasn't really the case with these books, thankfully. It really worked for me because Elle has a really dry tone, and we're just getting her running commentary on things that are happening. And it also kind of feels like she is engaging with us. She's not like, dear reader, I married him, not like that. But she's quite aware in how she's talking to us, especially towards the end of the trilogy. So in the Golden Enclaves, there are a lot of moments where she's like, and of course I did this, except of course I didn't do that. We all know me better. And it was really nice to feel like I was not in on the joke, but like I was on the inside with her, that I understood her and that she as a character kind of felt comfortable to show us her flaws. Maybe I've thought about that too much, but that's how it felt to me. I really felt like I was getting to know her even better, and that I was one of her kind of trusted friends that she was willing to share difficulties with. That just works really well for me. Also, the descriptions throughout the trilogy are really good. I really got a sense of kind of how the Scholomance worked and how they got there and what their kind of rooms looked like, what the library looked like, and I love those parts of fantasy books, especially dark academia books, when you get a sense of, oh, okay, now they're rushing to this class, and there they're learning this, and these are the labs where they get to construct these things, and this is what the dining hall looks like, and these are the alliances at play. It's kind of how in every solid action movie you need to have a boot camp or training scene. Like that for me in a fantasy book, especially one that plays with dark academia. I need to see them go to class, I need to see them struggling about homework, and I want to have the idea that I could find my way through this school. And that really worked throughout these books. And by the time that the story kind of moves away from the Scholomance and into the big world, I was quite invested in the school, even though it was a terrible place to live. What I also liked is that once we get to see the wider world, that the story actually moves around quite a bit, which might be difficult to adjust to pace-wise when you're reading the books, but Elle then travels around a lot, gets to see a lot of different places, and each of those was really described in a way that makes sense. So each of the enclaves that she sees, it makes sense for that place to have an enclave that looks like that. That just showed that Novik really put some thought and attention, I think, into her world building, which is always good. You don't want to have the feeling someone's just kind of figuring it out in the last book because they realized, oh yeah, wait, there's an entire world here. And that's also just something that plays throughout the plot. There are a lot of things that happen where you're like, oh, okay, so we need to figure this out and we need to figure that out. And that comes up really quite naturally. And some of that kind of is revealed in big plot twists. Kind of. There's not really a shock element. Like, Novik isn't trying to pull the rug out from under you and be like, haha, I bet you didn't expect this. But she does kind of reveal things to you where you're like, oh, that makes so much sense, but I wouldn't have considered that. Or that's absolutely horrifying, tell me more. And all of that really plays into the various themes that she is setting up. Before we go into those themes, though, there is something worth addressing about A Deadly Education, which is that there was something of a controversy about it, and especially the writing. As I mentioned, the Scholomance is a dangerous place where the mals are constantly lurking around every corner, in the ceiling, under your chair, in the shower, ready to grab you. As such, most students keep their hair short so it cannot be grabbed or nothing can kind of end up growing in there. In the kind of discussion of that in A Deadly Education, there is a line in which Novik describes dreadlocks as not being an ideal hairstyle for these reasons. This was picked up on by many readers correctly, I think, for echoing racial stereotypes against dreadlocks as being dirty, unkempt, etc. While that description technically made sense within the world of the Scholomance, it still, of course, hits very differently for readers now. This should absolutely have been picked up on by an editor or a sensitivity reader. But the good thing is that once it was pointed out to Novik by readers that this thing that she'd put into her world building, which actually relied upon racial stereotypes, she apologized. And I think, if I'm correct, kind of future reprints also changed that paragraph. There is an excellent blog post about some of the accusations, so this one, but then also other things, which is called The Intersectionality of Magical Academia, a Review of a Deadly Education, by a Naga of the Nusantara. It's a really insightful post, and the writer themselves is Chinese, so they're also able to address some of the criticisms leveled at Novik a bit better than I can. And they also point out the constant themes of class, privilege, and wealth that echo throughout the novel. And I think that's a very difficult topic that Novik clearly wants to highlight and address. And that blog post really shows how some of the criticism may be correct, but how it then also undermines the things Novik is trying to do. So I'll link to that post in the description. While A Deadly Education is not perfect, I don't think all of the criticism is equally valid, and some of it kind of is outright not applicable. And the extra criticism, I think, kind of dimmed the spotlight on the issues, especially the issue of how dreadlocks are described, which kind of did need to be addressed and fixed. Unfortunately, fantasy writing is still rife with appropriations, misunderstandings, and racial stereotypes, many of which are actively insulting, many of which, however, are also just kind of mistakes or things authors engage with without being aware of its history. Conversations about that are very important, and they do require a certain nuance, though, and a highlighting also of voices that can more actively speak towards the impact of certain authorial choices. But the ideas of class, privilege, and wealth, which a Naga of the Nusantara mentions, really grow in importance throughout the second and third book of the trilogy, and they're also one of the main reasons I enjoyed this entire trilogy so much. The Scholomance Trilogy has a really broad cast of international characters. Elle herself is half British, half Indian, so she's British Indian as a character, and her race does kind of play a big role throughout. She was raised in Wales by her mother, and she doesn't have that much contact with her father's family because he tragically died, and they kind of cast her and her mother out because of a prophecy that I think her great-grandmother made about her. So there is kind of a lot of tension for her around her race, which I think is explored in a very interesting way. But also the supporting characters, or just the cast of other characters, are very international. They're from different backgrounds, different countries, and all of their skills and backgrounds kind of play an important role in all the plans they make to kind of survive, and then the plans they make once they're out of school. I saw some reviews which were kind of a little bit critical, where they're like, oh, this character only comes in when their language is useful. But actually, I think that's not the case. And that's also something that gets addressed in that blog post I mentioned. And this really broad cast of characters also allows the book to kind of, or all of the books, to kind of engage with how these people try to find common ground despite their different backgrounds, and how they can maybe work through suspicions they have towards each other. And those suspicions are really based on the idea of enclaves. I've mentioned those enclaves a few times now, and what they basically are is magical communities which get built kind of within the void to give magic users a safe place to live, where they're protected against these mals which roam the earth, and where they can kind of pool all of their mana, so all of their power together, so that everyone can live safely and have access to power. But these enclaves are very exclusive. It really depends on how much power you have, whether you're from the right family. So I think we can all understand the kind of class and privilege things which play a role in that. And there's a really clear line between the enclave kids and the other kids in the school as well. And technically, the idea of an enclave is very understandable because people want to keep their kids safe. So it makes sense that people work so hard to get into an enclave. But there are also these places where wealth gets hoarded, and people who are not technically part of an enclave kind of get exploited in the hopes that their children may one day be allowed into an enclave. So it's something everyone aims for, to be included in that. But Elle didn't grow up in an enclave because her mother was very much against how they worked, and she never quite understands that until she learns more about how they're set up and how they function. I was really intrigued in how that then especially came through in the Golden Enclaves, because it really engages with the idea of what does it take to build up such a stronghold of power? What is that based upon? And there's a lot of, I would say, anti-colonial and anti-imperial dialogue with that as well. And that's something I hadn't seen in a whole lot of dark academia literature until now. I would say Babel by R.F. Kuang kind of engages with that very strongly as well. The idea that power and safety, as they go hand in hand, rely upon excluding others, and that the safety you create for yourself puts others at danger. And that also brings me to another thing, which I enjoyed about the last book, which is that the ending is quite grey in a sense. So in the Golden Enclaves, Elle has this manuscript, which would allow her to set up enclaves in a way that is more inclusive, that is more open to others, because usually the building of an enclave requires insane amounts of mana, insane amounts of power, and that's just something that's not accessible to most people. But still they want a place where they can be safe and keep their children safe. So while Elle kind of figures out how she could go about setting up these enclaves, she also has to accept that things aren't black and white, that even if there is a better alternative, people might still want to rely upon the old traditional way of doing it because it's what they know best. And she can't change the world through kind of one decisive victory in battle, you know. There may be a big bad that she wants to defeat, but will that actually help her change the world? And is changing the world something that a person can even achieve on their own? So there's also this very big emphasis on collaboration, on understanding other people and working together to try and do something good. And the way that kind of this younger generation of magic users, wizards and witches who come out of the Scholomance, the idea that they come together to figure out a plan of how can we change these power structures that exist in our world. How can we work with what we have but try and build something different? That was just really inspirational to read, and I was quite affected by it in a way as well. And I like that Novik didn't take the easy way of being like, oh, see, now there's an alternative, so no one would ever do something potentially bad again. Like, no, that's not how it works. And having your main character be someone who's very strong, but nonetheless not capable of being the hero who fixes everything, I think is very, very powerful within fantasy literature. And the idea that actual real change in the world is created through a network of willing and capable people who keep each other informed, work together, and just have faith in each other. That was a really nice thing to read, and I think it gets worked out really well in this trilogy. And then a final thing, just about the young adult kind of fantasy genre. It often has a romance subplot, which in many cases is actually the main plot. I kind of struggle with those books which are set in really interesting kind of fantasy worlds where there's loads of interesting things going on, but really what it's really all about in the end is if she gets her man. And I always feel like that's a bit of a betrayal to all the world building work an author is doing. But it's also something that in and of itself is a completely acceptable subgenre. Like if your main interest is in romance fantasy, that's absolutely fine. There's great books for that. And I don't see anything wrong with that. I also enjoy reading a romance every once in a while. But when I'm reading fantasy, I want the emphasis to be on the fantasy. And I've seen some reviews which have kind of complained about how the romance subplot is handled in the final book, because it doesn't take center stage in a technical sense. Because what you're maybe hoping for is these characters spending loads of time together and for the romance to really build and for them to take next steps in their relationship, etc. But really what we're getting is the impact of a potential romance on Elle. So she really has to deal with her feelings and how she feels about certain people and what place love or sex might actually have in her life. And let's not forget, we're in the middle of sort of life-changing events, not just for Elle, but also for all the other people she knows. And where is the time for romance? Is kind of love the most important thing, or are there other things that you need to focus on? I like that the novel engaged with that element of romance. And there's still some lovely scenes in there. The romance isn't completely absent, but romance and sex are treated as something that are natural, but also something that is kind of a normal part of it. It doesn't have to be the biggest thing going on in your life. Human connection is important and it's a natural part of living your life, but there are also other things going on, especially if the world might end, or at least the world as you know it. So yeah, I guess for those readers looking for really strong romance, this may not necessarily be the trilogy for you, but it is there, and it's a solid part of the whole trilogy, I would say. I hope that's given you a little bit of an idea of what the Scholomance Trilogy is about the way it plays with dark academia, about the sort of more action scenes, which I haven't even mentioned that much, but there's a lot of training to fight mals, especially in the second book, and I love those scenes. It's that boot camp scene. Just like in dark academia, I want to see them do homework. If they're going to fight, I want to see them practice. And I want to see them kind of struggle. And it was nice that also continued into the third book, where they're like, we've been training for a year. We're in excellent shape. Let's go kick some ass. So yeah, the action scenes are also really good. The writing itself is just really well done. You get a really good sense of the characters, of their connection to each other. The world is built up in a very interesting way. And it kind of goes from this microcosm in the school to something a lot bigger in the final book, where all of these things suddenly start making sense once they burst out of this bubble that the school kind of is. And that's another thing in dark academia, education comes to an end at a certain point, and then everything you've learned, you're going to have to try and apply in the real world. And I really like that the Scholomance worked on that as well. So those are my thoughts on the Scholomance. If you've read the books, I would love to hear what you think. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.